Hey there. We're having a wild ride, aren't we? This year, we are currently watching America come to terms with police brutality and the undeniable influence of white supremacy in a nationwide uprising on par with the civil rights movement. The government's botched response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the general fragility of neoliberal capitalism has led us into a recession that could turn into a depression to rival the Great One. And it's an election year where the incumbent has pretty much gone full mask off and the opposition candidate seems like he's trying his best to throw the game. These are trying times for the empathetic and progressive minded. The kind of times where you take something for your aches and immediately fall asleep only to wake up later and realize that your pain was the only thing keeping you upright. The kind of times where you look at your dog sleeping in the corner and feel jealous of their carefree outlook. Just look at her, laying there without a care in the world. I admit it, sometimes those bad thoughts come creeping in. Sometimes you sit back and reminisce about those simpler days before your hypertension meds had to work overtime to keep your heart from punching a hole in your chest and saying, I'm a head out. It's okay to admit that at times you want to go back to whatever you called normal. My last video was about how we cannot allow our country to go back to normal because the normal we knew was brutally oppressive, exploitative, and rife with systemic inequalities. My only regret is that there was so much that I left out. So I can't help but revisit this subject. After all, if you are trans, a woman, a Mexican or South American immigrant, housing insecure, poor, non-white, non-Christian, or just worried about a silly thing like, dying as a result of climate change, then you know, as well as I do, that we can never go back to normal. Have you ever thought about why it rubs you the wrong way when you see one of those asinine red hats? The phrase, "Make America Great Again," implies that the speaker wants to revert to a previous point in history. And while America has certainly had better moments than the current time, the fact of the matter is that turning back the clock in the United States is rolling back rights for marginalized people. This is what we have to remember when we talk about returning to normal. As I've said before, normal isn't good enough. Normal wasn't cutting it. As recently as last year, we had states trying to pass bathroom bills, forcing people to use the restroom of their genders assigned at birth, in an attempt to legislate away the autonomy of trans and non-binary persons. And in case you were worried that only transgender bodily autonomy was at stake, not to worry. We also had numerous states, including my own state of Ohio, over the past 2 years attempt to pass heartbeat bills or legislation criminalizing abortions after the discovery of what they are intentionally falsely characterizing as a heartbeat in a developing embryo. This is what constituted normal before the pandemic. Staying on the subject of mothers, if you happen to be a migrant mother from Mexico or South America attempting to escape persecution or violence, you'd arrive to our shores only to find out that as a country we've spent the last decade or so demonizing and vilifying our southern neighbors. This isn't new. George W. Bush was talking about building a wall back in the early 2000s. Barack Obama was literally the deporter-in-chief, forcefully removing more immigrants from the country than any president in history. Not to mention immigration courts trying minors who are representing themselves. Again, this all predates the pandemic. Elected officials fomenting immigration panic and xenophobia is a problem that's literally old enough to drive. Oh, Barry, you're gonna get your video too. Don't you worry. You see, it was a lot easier to pretend that the normal was acceptable when the president was a bit more polite in his murderous inhumanity and focused most of his violence overseas where we were less likely to notice. Oh, I'm coming for you, Barry. I'm coming. We've actually had a long history in this country of doing a pretty terrible job of taking care of the less fortunate. The housing crisis was never not a problem, at least in my lifetime. It is a symptom of a morally bankrupt society when 16 million homes sit empty while 8 million people are housing insecure. But what makes that an even more painful statistic is when you learn that the United States holds 22% of the world's inmates despite being 4% of the population. Wow, Why isn't that the dog whistle? Should we start pushing 22-4 memes? We aren't willing to subsidize housing for the homeless and the underprivileged unless we decide that they deserve to be thrown in a cage. You may be inclined to think that this is strictly people who deserve in prison, but then you dig a little deeper and learn that of the 631,000 people inhabiting local jails, 470,000 or 74% of them aren't even convicted of a crime. They're just suffering from our embarrassing and outdated cash bail system, meaning that unless they can afford bail, they have to wait in a cell until their actual trial date. All the while, the system claims that until you are proven guilty, you are innocent. Hey, I thought we got rid of debtors' prisons. Anyway, many prisoners are forced to perform physical labor at an almost non-existent salary just to keep the wheels of capitalism turning for a number of industries, including call centers, assembly lines, and firefighting, to name a few. The horrors of our prison industrial complex existed long before the pandemic. Anyone who has been in prison or worked with former inmates could tell you that our prison system has been broken for a very long time. And many of these prisons completely failed to account for prisoner safety during the pandemic, which was to be expected when you have a country that thought for-profit prisons were a good idea. As a result, there are numerous prison uprisings gaining headlines at the time of writing, and I for one hope that this sends a message to the ruling elite that can't be ignored. On the labor side of things, unions were dealt perhaps their largest blow back in the 80s by the Reagan administration. Right now, 27 states still have right-to-work laws. The biggest corporations in America also tend to pay their entry-level employees the least while taking in government subsidies by the millions. Walmart has 2.2 million employees, and despite their $500 million in revenue, they cost the American taxpayers $6.2 billion in public assistance. Now, I am not blaming their workers, and I'm happy for any public assistance making it to the hands of laborers who need it the most. Honestly, I wish it were more. But why is a company that can't pay its staff a living wage without government subsidy still able to pocket profits in the tens of millions every year? Why do they get to exist to begin with? Especially after they kicked out all of the small businesses when they moved in. I don't know, maybe we should perhaps seize their means, take their stores, stock the warehouses, and nationalize them and collectivize them into a public good. And if they say disagree with this plan, well, here's a completely unrelated video that has no bearing on our current conversation. We could make the Walton Airs like state mascots or something. That'd be fun. But I don't want to make this whole section just riffing on capitalism. My main point is that the problems with corporate America were entrenched in our society long before the pandemic came along. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, we're all cooking to death in this inferno because the most powerful people in our country are either doing their best to ignore climate change, or in the case of the current president, actively deny its existence. Honestly, it could be said that for a few brief months, the pandemic was the best thing to happen to the environment. Fish could be seen returning to long-polluted urban waterways. The air over major cities became clearer due to a lack of cars on the road. Nature began its own healing process. And let's not forget that prior to the pandemic, what we considered normal actually included some apocalypse-adjacent events, such moments as a sizable chunk of Australia catching fire and burning, a man-made fire burning a scar across the Amazon that just so happens to contribute most of the oxygen to the planet, large chunks of California burning to the ground year after year. Oh my god, so many fires. 5 hurricanes hitting the Gulf in rapid succession. And I could go on and on. Honestly, it's too much to cover, and I lack the skills and education to do a massive topic like that justice. Just know that if the Pentagon was working on a climate response more than 3 years prior to this pandemic, it has been an issue for a very long time. Now, our own armed forces recognize climate change, even when the fascist in the Oval Office denies it. Normal has failed. Normal, as a concept, protects the status quo. And in America, the status quo is kicking down marginalized people, worker exploitation, and fueling capitalism until it incinerates us all in a climate-fueled disaster. Know that the majority of leaders in society will push to return to this normal. We have a dumpy, incompetent, senile, authoritarian nutjob in the White House, while major cities across the country are rising up against systemic racism and police brutality. All the while, the best candidate the Democratic Party could come up with in opposition was the author of the crime bill and his cop buddy. The DNC is basically wearing a sign that says, "Devil you know." This is them saying that they want nothing to do with systemic change and would rather go back to their quiet oppression of the masses. Regardless of who wins the upcoming election, do not let them return to the old system unchallenged. No matter how hard they try, no matter how much they obfuscate, deviate, or redirect, hold their feet to the fire. All levels of government, every influential public figure, every corporation, send them the message that we cannot, should not, and will not return to normal. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, click the bell to receive notifications, and let me know in the comments any other facets of society that used to be normal, which we should do away with. Follow me on Twitter, where I show you the finer points of beard care. Follow me on Twitch, where I play games and give lectures. And if you are so inclined to support the channel, I do have a Patreon. Thanks again.